Good morning, distinguished guests and our colleague and our student. Now we have a very short the opening ceremony. The first, we welcome to the Professor Zhang Shuanli giving welcome speech. He is the dean of our school. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to attend this opening ceremony of this academic conference. And it's a great honor for us to have invited all of you here to attend this international academic conference on global ethics. Firstly, let me to take this opportunity to express our warmest welcome to all of you. I guess it's already well known to all of you that the School of Philosophy here is one of the leading philosophical institutions in contemporary China. And we have more than 60 faculty members within the School of Philosophy. And within this group, we have scholars doing researches in almost all the different areas of theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. Ethics has always been one of the most important areas for this group of scholars. And the topic of this conference is extremely important for us now. We all know that in the past several decades, philosophical discussions about global justice, about transnational normative orders, all of this has already been there. But when these issues have been talked and have been discussed in the past several decades, it's always with deep optimism. And we always feel that with this global neoliberal system being there, and philosophically it's very easy and it's very helpful for us to talk about these transnational normative orders and global justice. But as is stated in this invitation letter, I have read that very carefully, and I think that this can express their intention and their idea about why they are organizing this academic international conference at this particular time. The context has changed greatly, and there has been deep, challenging questions there, structural problems, and also theoretical problems. So how to articulate these deep, difficult challenges in theoretical categories and concepts, and how to revive the discussions, constructive discussions about global justice and global ethics has really been taken as the most important theoretical issues we definitely need to face up to. And in this sense, we are very happy that even though we have met with a lot of difficulties, but we finally have brought all of you here, and we have this conference, and I hope that we could have very good discussions and very important exchanges of ideas and thoughts at this conference. And I hope that you will have a very impressive discussions here and have very pleasant time during this weekend. Thank you.
Now we are welcome Professor Luca Scanratino giving his speech. He is president of International Federation of the Social Philosophical Society. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this warm welcome. And let me say it's a privilege, an honor, you said, and also a privilege to be here with you and to address this international conference. And it's a privilege to do it in such a lovely place as the School of Philosophy of Fudan University. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Professor Zhang. Thank you, Professor Deng. And I said I just wanted to say a few words. I didn't want to give a paper. So I prepared a paper, and I'll say something a bit more, still short, but a bit longer than just a few words. So in my understanding, one of the things we could discuss with Professor Deng over the last few days is that this meeting has a very meaningful and, if I may, very commendable goal, which is proposing a revised set of patterns to search for a common cross-disciplinary ground for moral understanding and behavior. You see that in this long statement, I carefully avoided the word global ethics, try to turn around it. It seems to me actually that your intention parts ways with the program originally proposed by Hans Küng in the early 1990s. If I may very respectfully say that, I think it's a very wise choice. It was, and still is indeed a recurrent temptation to look for a set of core values that would form a minimal cross-cultural common ground, at least in a philosophical context. This program, which essentially summarizes Küng's idea of a global ethics, very briefly, this program seems to me inherently contradictory. One of the ideas, that was the old objection by Michael Walzer, is that the very idea of values changes across cultures. We may largely agree that freedom, liberty, is a value. Who doesn't want to be free? But do we actually mean the same thing when we talk about it? Are we sure that the demands for more freedom that we witness and have been witnessing across the world refer to a same set of behaviors, of attitudes and opportunities? Or are we perhaps sometimes imposing our own conceptions of freedom, as those of democracy, of free speech, of justice, and so on? Are we imposing them to others' claims? Or else are we imposing them in forms that are not fully consistent with the sense and the historical developments of other civilizations? If we look at the larger context in which philosophers and other scholars work today, we observe around us, on a virtually global scale, an intense and possibly an unprecedented wave of concurrent crises. Sanitary crisis, military, political, economic, and of course environmental. At the same time, we also observe new technological and scientific transformations, environmental concerns, of course, but also artificial intelligence, ethics of the new technologies, and not for the least, new educational concerns prompted by the extensive use of new technologies in daily life. These are just a few examples of new phenomena we are witnessing on a daily basis. Altogether, we also observe something that may not be fully perceivable in the public discourse, which is the concept of nation is eroding in a global order increasingly dominated by a directorate of so-called civilization states. This applies in particular to societies such as the European ones, who slowly emerged through the Middle Ages and modernity along with the principle of national cohesion. These societies are now facing a disaggregation of such principle, or at least a significant loss of its relevance. Things like linguistic unity, national economy, national security, borders, instruction, food, fashion, and many others are becoming increasingly blurred in a world where political, economic, military, technological, and cultural power seems to be increasingly converging towards a limited number of global forces. Differences are still there, of course, and they are likely to be there to stay. But the ability of thinking in terms of a single culture, of one's own culture, or as we often hear, of one's identity, this ability is no longer effective in a world where ideas, languages, habits, and styles circulate across the continents and constantly merge into each other. The political reactions we observe at multiple levels, particularly with the steady growth of right-wing movements in Europe, and not only in Europe, these reactions seem to stem from these ongoing transformations. My point here is that in this prospectively post-national world, scholars, including philosophers, are likely to play a critical function of connecting worlds, securing permanent scholarly exchanges, building academic networks across political boundaries, and altogether helping diverse cultural systems merge into each other. This seems to me, if I may, the overall intellectual and social background of this workshop. Now, the idea of reconstructing a global normative order, as is specified in the invitation sheet, this idea faces at least a double danger. The diversity of cultures, which in philosophy might be called a plurality of transcendental systems, the barbaric expression, this diversity of cultures should not be reduced to one of its expressions. By affirming the primacy of an intentional system of a culture over the others, explicitly or implicitly, we would easily endorse this pretty obvious and authoritarian stance. Explicit instances of such stance would include overclaims of cultural superiority or supremacy. Implicit cases would more subtly involve upholding the philosophical canon within limited cultural boundaries, assuming a particular set of epistemic coordinates as priming over others, or even distinguishing between art and culture when it comes to aesthetic creations across cultures. We can name this attitude as reductionism or as dogmatic universalism, or building on Max Scheller's formalism in ethics as cultural relativism. In either case, it would lead to all sorts of fundamentalisms: religious, political, ethical, moral, and even theoretical for philosophers. By denying the plurality and diversity of intentional horizons, each one in its own right, and by forcing human rationality to one of its particular moments, that's how we introduce forms of prevarication and subalternity that form the epistemic roots of violence. We may think, for instance, of freedom of expression, an inviolable principle for Western modernity, a principle which possibly finds its own one and only limit, if any, in the equally inviolable respect for the individual in the public sphere. In other cultural social bodies, the same freedom may nonetheless find different boundaries. For instance, in the sacredness of cultural, spiritual, or religious structures considered as constitutive of the social bond, structures that were largely challenged and, so to say, debunked by and within Western modernity, but not within other cultures. And the point is not to say within other cultures yet. There is no yet. It's a different development. On the other hand, though, the plurality of cultures, the plurality of transcendental systems of ideas should not be reduced to historical ethical systems either. Attempts to situate interaction between cultural systems on the ground of habitus, of ethics, would make exchanges hardly practicable. There is hardly any exchange if we assume that our culture consists of what we eat, of how we dress, of our weekly calendar, or of our manners. This is yet another kind of relativism, a sort of traditionalism which would reduce cultural interaction to ethical systems, to habits and lifestyle, precisely the conditions of our daily and social life. And it might be worth observing that the starting point of Samuel Huntington's theory of a clash of civilizations was precisely a definition of culture as, in his word, a set of acquired forms of behavior. In other terms, a reduction of culture to ethics, and consequently an identification of culture and ethics. Now, the 20th century theory of morals have largely been aware of these dangers. In some cases, the focus of moral reflection to find a solution was shifted to avoid these dangers. The focus of moral reflection was shifted towards the idea of a formal criterion, which might be used for assessing the axiological value of an action or of a belief. A criterion that would be embodied in different shapes in a plurality of system of value, in a plurality of ethical systems throughout history. In other terms, we could reasonably claim that the theoretical conditions for a cross-cultural interaction depend on a formal law of morality rather than on a universal ethic. There is no room here, of course, even for a philosopher, there is no room to even start describing what such a formal law could look like. Yet we know that in the history of Western culture, a formal such principle has been described through the notion, for instance, of human dignity, a formal concept whose actual contents depend on the context and which may even be in apparent contradiction. What may be an infringement of a person's dignity in one context due to a particular cultural history may have a different meaning in a different culture. built on another set of criteria about what may be accepted or not. Think, for instance, how diverse the relation to one's own body may be across civilizations. Here we are obviously walking on a very thin and dangerous line, and a moral system that replaces or would replace a categorical structure with a contextual one needs to be handled with a lot of care. However, it is hard to say that dignity has a permanent, fully shared universal content other than its inherent normative principle. A law that prescribes that no individual can be forced into anything against their will. If we now look beyond the intellectual history of the West, we find that yet another formal principle of human action has been diversely described over the course of time and across various cultures, and is commonly known as the Golden Rule. Probably not the only such principle, but certainly a well-established one. In its negative formulation, do not do unto others what you would not be done by, the rule works, if I may say this, as a formal a priori of the moral world. It carries no substantial content, no precepts, no actual values. It does not prevent us from stealing or killing or do other things that we usually consider as bad, nor does it tell us what we should or should not do. It rather introduces the attitude that we shall adopt we should adopt to behave in a morally acceptable way. In so doing, it precisely serves as a constitutive statement to establish the moral world in its own autonomy. The concepts of good and evil, for instance, which play a role in morals, are implicitly introduced on a behavioral basis, and the rule leaves to each individual the duty, hence the responsibility, to decide what the most appropriate behavior would be depending on the context. There is no rigid norm here that would state what is to be done, thought, or desired. Morality is constituted as a formal field where decisions shall be made each time according to the context and to the purposes to be realized on a, of course, long-term scale. And we aren't told anything about the context nor about our purposes and desires, except that they must respect the law of reciprocity. This is very brief, I'm aware. From this formal approach stem several key concepts which are instrumental to build an open, non-authoritarian world of morality. The most pivotal of these concepts are probably generosity, benevolence, caritas, vulnerability. And we can already start seeing how this formal approach leads us into a very open cross-cultural approach to morality, so kind of a global law or cross-cultural law of morality, cross-cultural formal conception of morality. Anyway, there is no time here to elaborate on these ideas, fortunately for you, as I understand that this meeting is meant to be the first of a durable series, which we hope will last as long as possible. I would like to congratulate you all, Professor Zhang and Professor Deng in particular, and all those who helped prepare this meeting, for preparing it and for initiating this series. And may I invite you to continue this series and possibly develop it in the frame of the World Congress of Philosophy that will take place next year in Rome. Thank you.
Welcome the last speaker, Professor.
It's your turn.
Professor Dan Qing, he is the organizer of this conference.
Good morning. Distinguished Professor Luca Scanotino, Gaspar, dear Robbins, dear Mando, dear Wilson, 我们还有这个远道跨海来的李远哲教授，这个刚从美国回来的这个谢文玉教授，这个蔡恒庆教授，以及各位 这个包括我们的note 呀，以及所有各位朋友和学者啊，这个热烈欢迎大家，这个非常感谢大家。虽然这几天外面下着大雨，天气不怎么友好，但是我们复旦这个哲学学院和我们全球伦理中心，欢迎大家的心情是非常热烈和真挚的。30年前，这个世界宗教会议签署了全球伦理宣言，汉斯坤所提出的没有全球伦理，人类无法共存这么一个理念获得了这个重大的共识。那时候全世界人民还是带着各自对全球化的美好想象，共同追求一个共同的这个全球化的理想。但是30年后的今天，人们突然发现全球化的结果与当时人们各自的想象，基本上背离，因而共同的全球化理想，已经破灭。世界正在以不与人们想象的方式在急剧的变化之中，变得大家都不敢相认。世界发展中导致的分裂和冲突，让从前的现代性谋划基本上陷于失败。激烈的竞争和残酷的战争更让人类看不到未来。从前的冷战时代，以苏联为首的这个马克思主义阵营和以美国为首的自由主义阵营，还各自都有自己的精神信仰和精神灯塔但是随着冷战的结束，共产主义阵营的精神灯塔熄灭了，而自由国际主义在欢呼自己胜利的陶醉当中，也迷失了自己的方向，导致了今天重大的这样一个全球的危机。因而现在反全球化、逆全球化的各种极端的民族主义、民粹主义在全球沉渣泛起，世界进入了迷失的黑夜。在这样一个令人迷茫的时刻，我们复旦大学全球伦理中心的同仁们，我们这几位这个核心人员都在场。我们平时这个共同的讨论，深切地感受到，哲学的思想虽然仍然赶不上世界的日新月异的变化，但密纳发的猫头鹰已经到了必须起飞的时刻。世界急需改变，全球急需伦理，在规范秩序瓦解的这样一个现实面前，重塑面向全球化的世界精神，让人类拥有一个共同的未来，是我们思想的当务之急。因此，我再次感谢在座的每一个人在接下来的研讨中贡献自己的思想和才情。谢谢大家。没有。
因为郑老师刚才都那个说的这些内容，很多都会在他之后的那个报告里面。他的那个报告文章已经被翻译成英文了，已经在那个。
Okay. The Professor Ben is the opening speaker in the opening, as a speaker in the opening ceremony. His main content is in his paper. The paper have content in the class. Now我们记得这个结束了是吧？
对。The opening ceremony, and now we come to the first section. As I think the
没有照相环节。
在中午
好。好。We are first panel. We are now in the first panel. The first. The first speaker is Gaspar. He comes from the Tiamos University Rotterdam. Now, please.
So 点吧。
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organisers for. Many thanks to the organisers for inviting me. I feel intimidated at being the first speaker, and I tell you something about my background. I'm a social scientist. Interdisciplinary social scientist, but I have been working with a philosophical interest throughout my career and writing on various ethical questions also through my career. And currently now I'm one of the editors of a journal of global ethics. This one. I will make three main points, but I will first of all just say a little bit about my background coming out of the area of development ethics and extending into some themes of global ethics. Two central points. I think the first is familiar to you, but the global ethics is far more than international ethics, and that studying the range of actors involved, and then consequently the range of intellectual positions and ethics is a major task, what I call descriptive ethics. And then the biggest thing I want to underline is that given also this complexity of actors and there's a complexity of processes that building and modifying global norms is slow and complex and deserves study in itself as important, surprising, disappointing, but a big topic, and I will give some examples. And then lastly, very briefly, but in a way the most important point, from the Journal of Global Ethics, we are calling for short statements about current state of global ethics, thoughts about trajectory, possible revisions, possible reinforcements, to be published next year in a series of 3 sections in the 3 issues of the journal, and I will later pass out a flyer giving that call for papers. So I come from out of development ethics, studying ethical issues associated with socio-economic development, historically and contemporary. It's been pursued consciously and under that label for about 40 years now in the International Development Ethics Association. Next year is its 40th anniversary conference. And to a considerable extent also in Human Development and Capability Association, which is about 20 years old, and is within the framework especially of Sen, Nussbaum, and others. And then growing out of that, I worked quite a bit on nationalism and cosmopolitanism, but I won't talk about that primarily now, a little bit. And I've worked on this issue of how global norms emerge or don't emerge, various studies of sociological, historical studies of the successful and failed processes. So development ethics, I'm just going to point at this. I'm not going to try to give a short lecture. So, but ethical questions about processes of development, outcomes of development, attempting to be a similar subfield of practical ethics as business ethics or medical ethics, has been a small subfield because it is so broad in scope that it in fact overlaps with and has to draw from numerous existing other fields. This is the outline of a chapter I wrote recently in one of the main textbooks on international development studies. And the picture is from the film Avatar, if you recall, about the living in other people's situation, seeing the world through other people's eyes, and how it may change one. One of the themes in that chapter is limitations of classic Western ethics, as expressed by Bhikkhu Parekh, who is an Indian-British political philosopher, who has written on both Asian, so Indian, and European philosophers, and on issues of multiculturalism, and who specifically says, yeah, we draw from, we've lost the top of the slide, but it's about, he specifically picks out Kant, Mill, Locke, and Marx. He says these great thinkers all supported Western hegemony. They all supported Western colonialism as part of the global civilizing imperative, and yet none had been outside Europe. None had participated in dialogue with thinkers around the world, and in effect none did development ethics in the sense that is aspired to in the tradition that I'm working in, and for example in the International Development Ethics Association. A strong example of that line of work is here, a book about displacement, a product of many years of theoretical and practical work. And here I just want to underline that it brings out how displacement, which is a quintessential issue in development ethics, socioeconomic development brings displacement of many people, consciously and indirectly. Just like climate change is a quintessential issue of socioeconomic development. So displacement is quintessential, and it is not just a national issue, it is a global issue, because the forces involved in funding, in implementing, in responding to issues of displacement are global in terms of multiple governments, investors, funders, contractors, social movements, etc. So, development ethics leading me into global ethics. My interest in ethics while I was coming out of development economics began with Nozick in the 70s, and various development economists took up Nozick and said, well, here we have a clear principled ethics, and others said that this is so fundamentally inadequate in many ways, inconsistent, etc. Nozick as you know, is one base for of philosophical underpinning of neoliberalism, and then starting to think about the different stances of individualism, nationalism, etc., in reaction to thinkers like Nozick, led me towards a classification of positions in global ethics. This is written about 20 years ago, but anyway, that's where my mind still is. In the surveys of global ethics, which I read at the time, there was typically an expectation that the more that people accepted global values and responsibilities, then the less important they considered national boundaries. So 2 dimensions, but essentially you could reduce them to 1, because the positions in those 2 dimensions were expected to be so correlated. And you'll see in this table, well, there's some correlation if you proceed from the top right to the bottom left. So top right is no global responsibilities and very important national boundaries. And bottom left is major global responsibilities and unimportant national boundaries. And I argued, though, that in fact there are many other positions, and that became clearer also as I extended this table, adding more, an extra column and an extra row. So the yellow positions were positions that were not being highlighted in the global ethics literature at the time that I was reading this, about 2000. And yet these are real combinations. These are important positions. Often they are held also by actors other than states. And yet global ethics is also about actors other than states, about business corporations, about other social groupings, about persons, about criminal organizations. But even within states, there are many that take a position of espousing strong global responsibilities and strong national boundaries. All right, so I'm just, within the time available, all I can do is point at this, but to say that this descriptive mapping of intellectual positions, I think, is under-considered and yet is essential basis within global ethics study. It links to what the previous speaker was saying about Huntington, and in contrast with, let's say, Amartya Sen. So Huntington talks about 8 clashing civilizations. Sen talks about a world civilization. And he says that Huntington's picture of societies as definable and cohesive around, in his case, basically religious tradition, single variable, is seriously misleading and reflects also a seriously inadequate picture of personality, of persons. Persons are more complex. Persons are more flexible. Persons form more types of affiliation and association than in the monolithic perspective given by Huntington. So I think that's a fundamental issue in global ethics too. I don't have time to explore, but I like to present the Dutch artist Escher and his picture of, within his visions, things evolve, merge into each other, evolve further, diverge. So it's an issue of how far are groups and persons separate or interlocked and evolving. Let me move on now to the main thing I want to say, which is about global norms change. We do have multiple worldviews. We have, they are embedded. They change only generally slowly. We need coalitions between differing viewpoints. We know in the case of human rights norms, the interesting history of how these emerged over a long period. So what happened in 1948 comes out of previous centuries of thinking and living and dying. And then subsequently, in the 75 years since 1948, there have been periods of slow or no progress, and then there have been periods of relatively rapid institutionalization and adoption. And studying these processes, we see how they involve a combination of many levels of actors globally. And it has to be global to have some legitimacy, some plausibility, and some richness of intellectual basis. That's familiar. Let me go to the emergence of, the application of human rights ideas to the responsibilities of global businesses, which was at an impasse for decades, in which businesses declared, we are not charities, we can only help others by making profit. And social movements declared that no one is above the obligations of human rights. You cannot violate other people's human rights. And there's an impasse. And yet, in the period from the early 2000s to the mid-2010s, unexpected major progress was made, relatively speaking. And the guiding principles on business and human rights were adopted unanimously, have some degree of influence on many actors and in many fora. Initiated under Kofi Annan, this is his executor, John Ruggie, and some of you may know this book, Just Business, but there are many other statements as with intellectual content, but Just Business is interesting because it describes as the sociological, institutional story of how these norms emerged, were negotiated, accepted. I'm going to refer to three other examples, which I have studied myself. One is about the establishment of ideas of human development within the UN system, but then spreading extensively. Secondly is about the Sustainable Development Goals and how an ambitious, in some sense, set of goals was adopted universally. And the third is a failure case, relatively speaking. This is the Global Migration Compact. As background to the human development story, a bigger picture of analyses of how some ideas were cultivated, evolved, and possibly adopted in global system. So UN Intellectual History Project, huge enterprise of 17 books and many other products, analyzes attempts to create global norms in diverse areas, such as human rights. I have looked at the area of human development and the emergence of the human development reporting system and associated products some time ago, in that and various other articles. I'm sorry if I'm standing in your way, but I need to stand somewhere. So that analysis links to various discussions of how ideas emerge and spread within the international system. So, for example, Craig Murphy has done very interesting work. And he and others generate a sort of checklist that ideas that are influential, they suggest, are those that provide a way of thinking, way of seeing, so not just isolated information, that they have a value component which helps to motivate and also to then direct other thinking. What things do we need to pay attention to? They need to become incorporated into practical framework so that otherwise the ideas remain on paper. They need to be propagated through relevant networks, and they need to become embodied in an institutional infrastructure. And that infrastructure, though, needs to be motivated by the way of seeing, the value ideas, the practical frameworks which become its sort of brand, badge of identity, etc. So that was one case study on the spread of human development ideas in particular. The second case study, emergence of the SDGs, which was somewhat surprising. It was the merger of the global development agenda and the global environment agenda. And many people doubted whether anything so ambitious could be established given the divisions in the world. Interestingly, the SDGs are primarily generated from the South. In particular, initially, through Latin American initiatives. So the term SDGs comes from Colombia, and this lady is officially the originator of the idea, Colombian official, and then taken up by Brazil as chair of the 2012 Rio conference, and with building bigger alliances. And then in that period between 2012 and 2015, which was between the Rio conference and the adoption of the SDGs, that proved to be a favorable, it was partly a coincidence that there was 3 years available to negotiate these goals. And rather than normally conferences have a sort of lead-up period of a year or so, this was 3 years. It happened because 2012 was the 20th anniversary of the Rio Environment Conference, so that was a review moment, and 2015 was the end date of the Millennium Development Goals, and then it happened that there was a 3-year space which was used effectively. So there are interesting analyses by the actors involved. Various books have been published by participants, including especially the key figure in the negotiation, or as a single person, though there are hundreds of people involved, is Kamau, the Kenyan official representative at the United Nations, who was co-chair of the 2 stages of processes in 2012 to 2015, and then he's co-author of a fascinating book, and talking about how they used various devices to try and make progress in enormously complicated global negotiations. Huge range of topics, huge range of participants. Usually in United Nations conferences, you have 20 different proposed drafts all being projected. Everybody has made their amendments to the previous draft, and it becomes impossibly difficult. And instead, through an early stage of joint discussion of issues without attempting to take stances, sufficient trust was established amongst groups, across groups, and in the quality of the chair people, that the chair people acquired the ability to become the drafters. So the chair holds the pen. So rather than the chairperson trying to negotiate a fight between numerous different amendments, instead the chairpersons, Kamau and his colleagues, said, we listen to you, and then we, in good faith, make the next draft, taking into account, in our best judgment, your suggestions. And that worked. And various other interesting features, such as eventually the creation of the SDG logos, which has made them worldwide recognized, unlike most other previous international agendas. I'm going to leave this. There's an article in, not here, but it's in Journal of Global Ethics 2019, in which I do this sort of analysis for the SDG process. Why was this consensus reached? There are many limits in content to the SDGs, but yet the main purpose of the agenda is not a detailed plan, it's an attempt to specify some global norms. And norms are vague, and norms will be interpreted differently in different locations, applied differently, but that's the intention also, that there's then felt national ownership and acceptance to pursue these identified, mutually agreed norms. Lastly, as a case, Global Compact on Migration, which was signed at the end of 2018, I think. And again, a surprising achievement, though not all countries signed it. Some stood outside, but very large majority of countries signed the Global Compact on Migration, which had been unachievable for decades. It emerged partly out of processes of trust building, again initiated by Kofi Annan as the UN Secretary General from the 1990s, establishing something called the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which was established in the early 2000s, and then in the subsequent about 12 years built up some degree of mutual confidence and language and commitment on the part of wide range of international actors. and was the basis then for eventually creating in 2016 to 2018 the Global Migration Compact. But unlike the SDGs, which have attained some significant degree of global recognition, civil society acceptance on some level, the Global Migration Compact received big resistance in many countries in civil society. And so the lesson here is that, I say, building a feeling of we, of shared purpose, of, we could call it community of fate. Yeah, we share dilemmas that we must solve together. Within the world of migration specialists, which was achieved in that period under the Global Forum for Migration and Development, is very distant from building a felt we within wider political society. And you can have an interesting comparison with the SDGs as to why this was not achieved within the Global Migration Compact. And it leads to the general question of who is the audience being assumed when we are attempting to create global ethics. And there are many audiences, and how we bridge between audiences and how we move from also academics audience to a wider citizen audience is a massive challenge. And then lastly, this is the call for reflections from the journal which I participate in editing. The call has just appeared. I said I have a flyer which I will share with you, and it is for a set of special sections in next year's issues to mark the 20th anniversary of the journal, and we look for brief articles on future directions of the fields of global ethics, global justice and development ethics, and reflections upon critical challenges for these fields. And I hope that will interest some of you. Thank you very much.
Wait.
Yeah, allow me speak in Chinese. Speak. 我这个论文呢，这个是试图呢把汉斯昆全球伦理构想提升到一个哲学的基础之上，因此呢， 我先这个论文是要反思学术界对汉斯昆当时的全球伦理构想的一种批评，这个批评呢是非常严厉的，在一个考虑说他这个理论是radically inadequate and practically useless，所以这个批评呢是一个非常严厉的一个批评，但是我认为呢并没有抓到根本，因此我对汉斯昆整个这个理论是非常认同的，认同他2点，一点呢他提出了一种没有全球伦理，这个我们这个世界就没法共存这么一个理念。这个理念应该说是一直以来是获得一个最大的一个共识。同时呢，他在这一个理念基础之上，对这个全球伦理的必要性的这个论述，是我觉得这个是我们今天重启全球伦理的这么一个前提，但是这样一个批评为什么没有抓到根本？我现在我这个论文呢，就是试图呢这个对这个进行一个分析，这里关键问题呢就是说，整个汉斯昆当时推动的这个全球伦理的这样一个工作，是试图从世界各大宗教，基督教、犹太教、伊斯兰教、这个佛教，以及我们的道教，还有儒学，等等这些理论当中构建一个最低限度的一个价值共识，然后尤其从这个摩西十诫里面，这个提出一个这个己所不欲，勿施于人，不杀人等等，不偷盗等等，这样一个最低的一个规范的一个共识，这就使得呢这样的一个全球伦理一个讨论呢，这样一个全球伦理一个讨论呢，都是从一个，它不是把伦理理解为一个世界本身的一种构成性的一种规则，而是呢把从这个世界之外引入一个伦理规则来规范和引导这个世界的发展，我认为这个不仅仅是汉斯昆这样做，实际上所有西方哲学，如果我们坚持的是一个二元论的世界观，坚持本体现象这样一个划分，坚持主观客观，这个民族国际等等所有的这个二元划分，以后你从宗教的或者是形而上的形而上学构造出一个伦理原则，再把这个伦理原则应用到我们生活的这个世界，都会造成这样一个伦理它和这个世界相隔离的这么一个状态，所以呢是从这个世界之外去构造一个伦理原则，再把这个伦理原则往世界之内来运用，所以这样的一种方式呢，都导致了伦理原则的一种规范的失效，因此我在我现在整个这一个工作呢，都想呢试图有一个新的一个冒险，就是要重构一个伦理的概念。我们以前伦理概念大多太依赖于习俗的这么一个伦理观念，从习俗的宗教，从习惯，从这个现行的法律当中去引出这个伦理原则，但是我们是否有一种可能，把这个伦理原则就作为 世界本身的构成性原则，或者是把理解为存在本身的一种构成性原则，我认为这样的一种尝试呢，在西方哲学里面是有的，但是呢，由于我们过多的这个依赖于二元论的这么一个世界观，尤其现代以后，这个二元论世界观呢是非常明确的，因此呢，我是想要克服这样一个外在的伦理原则往生活世界内部这个应用来引导和规范生活世界的这么一个做法，要根本上进行一种转变，这样一种转变，呢，就必须要重构一种新的一种伦理观念，这样一种新的构建一种新的一种伦理观念，这伦理是作为一种存在的基本机制，存在的一种基本机制，要把这样一个基本机制构建起来，而把伦理作为存在的一种基本机制，我觉得这样的一种思想，在柏拉图，在这个斯宾诺莎，在海德格尔，在列维纳斯等等这些的思想当中，他有这样的思想资源，但是我们如何把这样的一种思想资源，把它系统的阐发出来，我觉得这个是非常重要的，但是因为这样的一个思想资源，就有一个非常大的一个冒险，因为现在一谈到柏拉图，一谈到黑格尔，大家都感受到这是一种总体主义的，这个总体主义，它必然就导致一种专制主义，必然导致一个系统的一个封闭性，因此在这样的一个对柏拉图黑格尔这种思想资源的这种借鉴之中，现在自由主义本身发生一种变化，就试图通过对斯宾诺莎的这么一个重新解读来激发这么一个资源。斯宾诺莎是一个非常典型的是一个一元论的，是从一种世界的自因，它区分两种自然，一种是创造性的自然，也是naturalans， 还一个是作为创造物的自然。我们一般的理解这个自然nature 就是把它作为一个自然物，已经创造出来的创造好的自然物。但是斯宾诺莎在他的理论当中，要把这种naturalans 就是创造自然的自然，它叫创造自然的自然，把这个自然作为一种构建性的一种自因的构建性的一个原理，所以把这个东西纳入进来，就有希望，因为斯宾诺莎也现在越来越被作为一个自然主义自由主义的思想资源，激进主义的思想资源，替它进行解读，这样就使得我们有可能构建出一个对把伦理作为存在本身的内在机制，然后呢又不是一个完全整体性的封闭性的那么一种形而上学，而是构建起一种自由的自然的自由体系，试图构建这么一种伦理观念。这么一种伦理观念，实际上呢，这种伦理观念如果能够构建起来呢，就能够克服这么一个整个西方思维二元论的这么一个思维，从原理到应用这么一个弊端，所以我从这个里面寻找思想资源，首先是柏拉图的伦理观念， 柏拉图伦理观念最重要的，柏拉图把整个知识分成逻辑学、物理学、伦理学，然后伦理学是对应于物理学，物理学研究自然的 logos， 对吧？自然的 logos， 伦理学对应于自然的 logos， 所以在柏拉图的这一个伦理观念当中，最重要的就是这个伦理。它里面引入了一个灵魂的概念，灵魂是一种生命自身的构成性原则，生命自身的构成性原则，所以把这样一个观念纳入进来，然后呢通过亚里士多德亚里士多德也是继承这个柏拉图这么一个灵魂观念，作为生命自身的一个构成原则。这样呢，这个生命就有一个内在的一个构造自身的一个原理所以亚里士多德在引入这一个观念的时候，他一方面呢有一个问题，就是他把这个形而上学和这个伦理学、实践哲学区分开来这一套原理是在他形而上学里面的但是这种形而上学原理成为实践哲学、伦理学，又有一个形而上学原理怎么到实践当中运用这么一个难题。但是在他的对伦理的这么一个解读当中，他还是从这个实践内在的这么一个实践，就是一种生命本身怎么从它的本性潜能到它生命这么一个本质的各种属性的全面实现，这么一个内在性的一个录像所以要把这一种录像揭示出来，在亚里士多德那里呢，也有非常多的这么一个这个资源。这个资源就是我们每一种存在，每一种实体，都是由自己它的原因在自身。亚里士多德说原因在自身，然后又通过自身把自己自身的潜能这个实现出来，所以把这一种观念建构起来，然后就可以有一种新的一种关于伦理和全球伦理这么一种观念这种伦理它作为存在的构成性原则，在海德格尔那他揭示了存在的正义这么一个概念存在的正义存在的正义，这种存在的正义是作为把所有存在者结合起来的一种方式存在是一种结合的一种方式把所有存在者没有这个存在正义的这么一种结合存在者他是很难具有自己的存在性这个存在不能够变成一个动词有了存在的正义这么一个把所有存在者结合起来，然后向着自身的本真存在这个去存在这样才使得这个存在它真正的所有存在者，它具有它自身的这一种存在性存在的一个向度因此在这样的一个观念之下构造全球伦理这个观念，就是说我们要把这个要确立一个这么一个世界的概念，但是这个世界不是所有存在者外在的我们生活在这么一个世界之中的这么一个空间概念，而是所有存在者在他要与他者要与其他者相互一起共存，它才能存在的这么一种存在方式当中，它所自身构造出来一个世界。所以这个世界和我们的存在不是外在分离的，而是在我们的共存的实践当中和其他的存在者相互的这么一个合作，相互的结合 然后产生出这么一个存在。因此，这么一个全球伦理概念，就是在那么一个我们前面见过的一个新的一个世界概念和新的伦理概念基础之上，才能形成这么一个作为存在机制的这么一个伦理概念才能建立起来。那么这个伦理概念，它首先是存在的正义作为一种结合性原则，结合性原则，它是要面向他者，面向所有其他的存在者，构成的一个共同的一个存在方式。在这么一个共同的存在方式确立下来以后，才有每一个个体自身的这种本真的所谓本真的这样一个存在。因此，在这样一个全球伦理概念当中，它既是一个面向总体的，但是同时也是每一个个体性的这么一个原则，而且这么一个原则又是一种内在的一种原则它的原因在自身之内的所以这么一个伦理全球伦理如果能够建构起来，我觉得它在目前这么一个情况之下，它有一个非常重要的意义，就是不仅仅是我们怎么样推动这个全球化的这么一个过程，而且最关键的是要化解现在这样的一个自由主义的危机和这么一个整个世界缺乏一个共同的世界精神这么一个状态。所以我觉得这个要解决这个我们目前所面临的整个全球化的危机，是要点亮这个世界精神的这个灯塔而这个世界精神的灯塔必须要构建起一个共同的全球意识在这样一个共同的全球意识当中，我们意识到每一个单个的民族、单一个个人没有一个世界共存的这么一个理念，每一个人的存在是不可能的每个人的存在生存是不可能的，也不可能变得更好因此在这样的一个全球伦理的理念之下，我们必须引导每一个民族它有自身传统的这个民族，让它这样一个民族传统的优秀文化在面向全球伦理的进程当中，在进入到世界历史进程的过程当中，让传统文化的这个精神发扬光大让传统伦理的精神呢这个向全球伦理这么一个共同的世界精神在靠近，在融合，这样呢促使各种本源的民族他们的这样的一个传统文化向现代化转型这样才能够化解这个后进的国家和先进国家这个自由主义传统国家和这样一个民族主义传统的国家这样的一个世界形成一个相互的一个共同的一个联合不能够在这样一个文化当中不能够单方面的强调任何一种特殊的文化占有一种优势占有一种优势所以呢是试图把这样一个存在的正义这么一个概念作为一个全球伦理这个全球世界的一种构成性的一个原则构成性的一个机制建构起来。好，谢谢大家。
One thing I noticed was that Professor Gasper and Professor Dung took very different approaches to global ethics, so that Professor Gasper thought that the most important aspect of it was building norms at a global level, and so there didn't seem to need to be any philosophical foundations for that. It just seemed to be that something like the Sustainable Development Goals, it seemed enough that people around the world could agree to a set of goals, and they didn't need to sort of talk about Hegel or Spinoza in order to get there. Whereas it seemed that Professor Dung had a much more sort of metaphysical view of what global ethics could be, and these seem to be quite different visions of what the subject is about, what the conference is about, and so I think it'd be worth sort of hearing from both how they sort of think about the other's approach, and maybe also from Professor Scarantino, who seemed maybe suggested something in the middle, suggesting, well, ethics has got to be involved, but it's an ethics of dialogue, of listening to one another and learning from the other in order to form a shared horizon. So there's maybe some fundamental ethics there, but only in quite a lightweight way. So that's maybe an attempt to kind of sum up and reconcile what we've heard so far. And I'd like to hear from any of the speakers whether they agree with that diagnosis of what we've heard so far, and if so, how we should take it forward.
Professor Gasper, have you any comments to this solution?
Yeah. I think the two are complementary. So I don't think either of us was trying to cover everything. So both are important. The focus at the level of institutions and negotiations, and the level of motivating perspective and values, which will partly be shared and partly differ, but yet you seek areas where you can still agree. So I think both are essential. I think Professor Dung is also, though, adding that we are in a new era of global danger and global threat, which I see especially in terms of the environmental crisis and climate change, which are issues not merely for centuries ahead, but in fact they are issues for the next few decades. Unless these are adequately, cooperatively addressed in the next few decades, then we risk a global disaster. So what he's advocating is intuitively appealing. At the same time, you need attention to how do you achieve anything within existing institutional structures, with existing institutional actors, within the next generation.
我自己是因为做西方哲学，这是一直我想这个把全球伦理呢，它的哲学基础在更加完善的这个确立起来，因为30年前的那个全球伦理宣言，我们感觉到呢，它在哲学基础上确实是非常脆弱的， 这种脆弱就导致它的规范性太弱，使得它在今天好像已经很难能够规范和引导这个世界怎么发展。
Professor Deng mentioned that he himself was always considering the Western philosophy. He was a scholar who researched Hegel and German idealism, and also he was the Humboldt stipendium stipendiant in German, so his major foreign language is German. So he feels sorry about. We feel sorry about that he cannot use English so fluently. And furthermore, talking about metaphysics, Professor Deng's main idea is that global ethics research 30 years before, that that declaration was lack of a solid philosophical ground, so which makes it has less normative power. And by talking about normative power, we don't mean that there are some political or realistical constraints or something like that, but we mean the normative power in a theoretical sense that makes us to believe there is kind of global notion of ethics. And so we are now trying to do this work to restart research of the global ethics in a different direction. That is the direction beyond all this normative level, to see whether there is some common views about the foundation of this, not about some universal values. We're not searching for the ground of some universal values, but for the ground of the possibility of talking about global ethics itself, talking about these issues at all. We are not expecting that we could reach some ultimate answer to the global ethics, but just finding a possibility of gathering all our friends here to talk about these issues. Yeah.
就是说，全球伦理呢，我觉得也是多样性的，就是说。可以从社会科学，从经济、社会发展这些方面去做，但是我们作为做哲学的，也是需要从哲学上面去反思，就是说全球化的进程肯定它的一个整个规范秩序的基础，依然是自由国际主义这一套理论，但是康德、罗尔斯。这一个方向的这个全球正义，它显然是也有很多的这个问题。另外呢，这个黑格尔主义的这个全球正义，它也有它的优势。但是呢，如何把这两种优势能够结合起来，我认为呢是目前是更加重要的。
Professor Tu mentioned that he do respect the diversity of the areas in the global ethics, like economy, like the ethics of development, and that's why we invite scholars from different research fields to come here to give us to broaden our horizon. But as a philosopher, we could do is to find some philosophical grounds or philosophical justification for the talking about global ethics. And he also mentioned already there are some philosophical thoughts about global ethics already been there, like Kant, Rawls, and Hegel, and he mentioned that each of them has some advantage, but also has some problems. So we are, he especially, are searching for some philosophical connection between these philosophical traditions and to see whether it is possible to build a kind of justification for the global ethics, to build a more solid ground for the development of the global ethics research. Yeah. I think that's all. Yeah.
Is there anyone?
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. From all three presentations, my question would be, I was a little bit interested to see in the fact that all three presentations converge in the fact that there's a need to get into dialogue. It's a need to move things in a certain direction. And Professor Scarantino talks about the need to build academic networks. And Professor Kasper mostly focused on the dynamism that is connected to political factors. And in Professor Dung's presentation, what I understood, it's the need for a consciousness of global coexistence. So my question is, again, I'm going back to the very general question of philosophy. Hegel's idea that philosophy only takes, the owl of philosophy only takes flight, only at dusk. What is the role of global ethics just to make sense of what is happening? Because from what I have noticed, mostly we scholars make sense of what is happening in the real world, or actually truly influencing. If the decision factor is political, even institutional, we have problems in generating that global coexistence, as Professor Dunn has said.
Yeah.
By the end of the day, I will be able to use this thing. Maybe I can say something also to comment on Professor Wilson's. I think what we have seen very briefly, well, mine was not a presentation, it was supposed to be a very brief thing. Then a philosophical need to libido loquendis. I think what we've been seeing very, very clearly, even in this very first hour, is that as it often happens, the idea of global ethics, like any other scholarly idea, very much changes according to the discipline. Okay, what Professor Gasper said about global ethics in the context of an ethics of development, the social sciences, makes a lot of sense from that particular disciplinary point of view. In the case of philosophy, my feeling, and I may be perfectly wrong, of course, is that it's not a task of philosophy to provide a protocol, a set of values, a protocol for action. I think that especially in a cross-cultural context, which is the essential part of what we call global, I think in a cross-cultural context, what philosophy might possibly do in an effective way is to provide the conditions for individuals and societies to develop an attitude of openness toward the other. And this might sound a bit kind of generic, but it has very much to do with the way how we interact according to the context. Again, it's not about providing a protocol. Sustainable development goals work very well in a different domain from the philosophical. Even philosophers are very much working on that now too. But the task of philosophy is a different thing. It's the same relation between physics and mathematics. Okay, we work in a I think philosophy should work at a different level, and the specific contribution that it can give has to do with a kind of an open framework and providing the conditions for humans, for people, for societies to behave in a way that, depending on the context, would be mutually of mutual acceptance, of mutual understanding, of mutual interaction, essentially. This is not only an individual thing. This has to do also with social behaviors, with social institutions, with ways, like there was a big point about migration. Migration is being a huge matter of political debate in Europe now, in a way that goes way beyond the effects of migration itself. It's really become a political stance, a political play played, by the way, on the lives of migrants. But think of how a society can integrate people from other parts of the world, from other religions, with other behaviors, in a way that would also change the society. Integration is not assimilation, okay? But this requires an attitude that is not only individual, is also social and clearly cultural. So philosophy, I think, can work at that level, at that stage, not at more practical thing, not only at a practical level anyway. That's my idea. But again, I think the debate is very open. And if I may, what Professor Deng said about the shift from kind of a set of ideas that are given from outside, kind of a elitistic way, if you want, and to be replaced by the more immanent conception of how we can work on an existing world, which is in itself problematic. But anyway, this, I think, goes in this very direction. I don't know if it makes much sense what I said, but...
May I just add some points of Professor Deng's? I noticed that Professor Scarantino and Professor Gasper all mentioned some similar words like attitude in Professor Scarantino's whole speech, and words of motivation in Professor Gasper's speech. And I think that's the point why we need such a philosophical view. Like, okay, we all know that we are facing some particular problems regarding the environment and the economics and some political problems. But the point is that why we have to take the views of the global ethics, why we have to take this view of the global perspective. It already contains some idea that we have to respect others, or we have to listen to others. We have to take your concerns seriously as well as my concerns. And I think the motivation or this attitude itself could just be justified by philosophical on a philosophical ground, on a philosophical level. I think as Rawls, Kant, and Hegel as well, they all have these ideas regarding the justification of why we have to listen to others. And this is the main point why we would like to, we were not expecting replace the traditional global ethics research in a practical way to a philosophical way. We're just talking about two different levels. We are just adding a new or something that should be there as a I don't know, not an improvement, maybe just some new horizon of the global ethics research. I think that's the point of Professor Deng. So we've just talked about this former, yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. Both are essential. And I referred in my presentation also, as you pick out, to value basis. I use also the term of vision, which if you examine in each of these cases that I presented, you can see that key leaders involved are strongly value-driven and at various times express also a value-based vision. Possibly there are differences, but we're looking for sufficient commonality to ground urgent action and cooperation. In my own work, I give a lot of attention to themes described sometimes as common human security, and also to the theme of solidarity, which is currently revived as United Nations language also, and by the Secretary General. And I think the theme of solidarity, is valid, and it needs also a grounding in vision of human existence on Earth, which I think is closely linked to the perspective of sort of a natural ethics, which Professor Dunn outlined.
The question may be towards Professor Dunn, and in his presentation, that one of the key terms is the justice of existence, and he tried to explain that when talking of the justice of existence, that means that it's like of course, if you define the existence in terms of a Heidegger, and that kind of existence is treated like our life, the human life, and the individual life. That means when talking of the justice of existence, it looks like the human justice. Well, in this way, you don't have to replace the term, play the term here, that when talking about ethics, that means that we have to seriously consider the concept of justice. That's the main point, yeah. But we have two ways to define the justice. One is defined by, like we set a common norm of the moral laws exactly of this kind. That means if your behavior is in conformation to the common norms, and in this group of society, that people may treat you as you do right, you do justly. That means there's a justice there. The justice sense. That means that the standard is that common norms. But we have another way to define the justice. But it looks like that if we have a similar sentimental order, or we have the same feeling to the certain things in the order of that structure of your sentiments. And then you may, even I don't have to speak anything, that if we have a similar order of sentiment, and what your behavior within this order of sentiments, well, there's a justice over there. We don't have to speak out, like in the family. Or we have we grow up in the same environment, and then we have really similar sentimental order. And then what is right behavior can be easily be like, well, I noted my head and then you got approval and it's like to that. The situation that means that justice comes from the sentimental order is different than justice coming from those common norms. There's a two way to define the justice. I mean, when we come to the connection between human beings, and we have the two connection is from the common law and moral laws is set up there is outside everybody, and if you behave according to it, that you will be judged as right, judged as justice. Where on the other hand, we have a similar sentimental order, and that will be different justice. I mean, if we consider there's two ways to define the justice, that the ethics will be completely different. I mean, sometimes, like in the conflict, in the international conflict at this point, that a lot of we call the nationalism and those kind of we have different, or most of the time we have different sentimental order. And I just don't feel you are right. Actually, we are doing the same exactly according to those common norms set up out there above us, but I just don't feel good. I don't feel right. But I mean, the two way of defining justice will bring up different global ethics. And this is my observation to it. The justice of existence, I mean, yeah, this is an interesting concept about how to define it. Maybe need more analysis. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Yeah, we have a certain speed. That's fine.
Yes, that is
I think it's a good way to connect the pure philosophical discuss about the ground conditions, and then to the lecture of Professor Robbins, more emphasis on the diversity and cultures, and I think it's really a nice connection. Thank you, Professor Xie, for this comments.
Now, welcome to Professor John Robinson. Can you please give them a speech?
Okay, thank you. No problem.
It is a problem.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm honored. I'm an anthropologist, so I am somewhat of a outside to this to the philosophical discourse on global ethics. But anyway, very, very grateful to be here. And the time is right for a conversation on the nature of global ethics. As the global order enters a period of fracture, various local pieties about the best way to live and to organize society are everywhere facing challenges and are open for discussion in ways they have not been for many decades. As international relations theorists have been quick to recognize, the present is a time where people cannot, as one of them puts it, afford to, quote, overestimate the probability that their local principles of justice and legitimate authority will be accepted by people in other societies. Indeed, as the global order shifts and many people no longer see their life horizons limited to the local communities in which they grew up, there are fewer and fewer incentives for them to assume that ethical principles rooted in their own cultural traditions are necessarily superior, either ultimately or prudentially, to those rooted in the cultural traditions of other societies. The period when many scholars invested in the Western liberal order thought globalization was fated to lead to an ethical universalism grounded on their own values that would be accepted around the world is coming to an end. This situation makes questions of how to frame a global ethics that could gain wide approval pressing, even as it promises to make them as difficult as before, or maybe even more difficult than before, to answer. I should say my text is in this book that we've got. I will skip some parts of it, but I'll mention when I'm skipping ahead. In order to map some of the terrain any attempted answer to the questions of how to think about global ethics will likely have to cover, I take up two of the important questions that were set for this workshop. I found the questions extremely congenial, and one of the questions I'm taking up is, are the various moral intuitions in different cultural and philosophical traditions commensurable? The second one I want to take up, quote, is, what is the minimum consensus on civilization that is achievable for humanity at this time? I will respond to these two questions as a cultural anthropologist, a member of a field that is dedicated to studying the diversity of human ways of life around the world. One of the fastest growing subfields of anthropology for the last 20 years has been what is called the anthropology of ethics. Those who work in this subfield, myself included, have invested considerable time in learning about philosophical work on ethics. This means that in answering the two questions I've mentioned, I will draw on some aspects of ethical and political philosophy, and I hope to do so without complete naivete. But I will at the same time develop my argument primarily through a consideration of the various ways anthropology has dealt with issues of ethical universalism and ethical diversity in the course of its own disciplinary history. In particular, I want to discuss one important shift in anthropology's approach to the diversity of human moral ideas that has occurred in the last 30 years, and then sketch another shift that I will argue should be made in the face of the current global situation. While I will address these issues in relation to the field I know best, I hope it will be clear by the end of my lecture that the shift in approach to ethics I'm recommending for anthropology, I also take to be a potential model for other disciplines to consider in approaching the relationship between the existence of ethical diversity and the task of developing a global ethics. Okay, let me start with the first question. Are the various moral intuitions in different cultural and philosophical traditions commensurable? From anthropology's origin as a proper social science in the late 1800s until at least the 1980s, the discipline's answer to this question has been a resounding no. Okay? On observation, even before one gets to any matters of theory or philosophical argument, moral intuitions are routinely incommensurable across cultures. There are some examples that are both dramatic and fairly widely discussed across academic disciplines, such as, for example, the fact that in some societies people have a strong intuition that infanticide is morally appropriate in some cases, and in others people have equally strong intuitions that it is never morally appropriate in any cases. But other less eye-catching examples are also in great supply and indicate the extent of moral incommensurability across cultures. Thus, for example, in some societies, most people hold that it is moral for a person to marry anyone of their own choosing that is not a child of one of their parents' siblings. In others, it is only moral to marry someone who is related to you as the child of one of your parents' siblings. But in some cases, the person you marry should be what anthropologists call a cross cousin. For a man, this is his mother's brother's daughter, or for a woman, her father's sister's son. I mean this to be a little confusing. Don't worry about following the details. But I'm trying to talk about the kinds of stuff that often escapes people's notice if they're not anthropologists. Yet in others, it's only moral to marry what anthropologists call your parallel cousin, your father's sister's daughter if you're a man, or your mother's sister's son if you are a woman. People living in societies where one or other of these patterns of marriage are normative have a strong intuition of the moral rightness of the pattern their society promotes and of the absolute moral repugnance of the other patterns. These different intuitions cannot easily be squared with one another or rationally ranked across cultures. I then spend a little time in the paper, and I'm not even sure I do successfully, but talking about how we might try to explain away these apparent differences in moral intuitions by saying that we've described them wrongly, or by referring to the ontological convictions of the people involved and showing that it's the ontological convictions and not the moral intuitions that differ. But I'm going to leave that out to try to not take too much time today. So now I'm skipping to page 4. Even as there exist cases in which what look like differences in moral intuitions are really about ontological or other kinds of disagreements, I think there are also many cases of diverging moral intuitions that are hard to understand as being about something other than morality. This point becomes clear when we look at the moral effects of what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls hypergoods. As Taylor defines hypergoods, they are goods within a society that, quote, not only are incomparably more important than others, but provide the standpoint from which these must be weighed, judged, and decided about. Adopting a more social scientific phrasing, we could call these hypergoods a society's high-level values and describe their effect as organizing the ranking and even the expression of socially lower-ranked values or goods. By way of familiar illustration, I can note that it's these kinds of high-level values that social psychologists and other scholars are referring to when they talk about major differences between collectivist or sociocentric and individualist societies. I assume that distinction is pretty familiar. In the former, the sociocentric or collectivist societies where the sociocentric or collectivist values are highest, it's the social whole that's most valued, and all other goods are ranked according to how much they contribute to sustaining that whole. In individualist societies, by contrast, it is the individual that's most valued, and all other goods are ranked by their contribution to allowing individuals to flourish in ways that they themselves choose. What I want to argue is that such high-level values are, speaking now in empirical terms, incommensurably different across cultures. Furthermore, it's important, I think, for the framing of this workshop, high-level values profoundly shape people's moral intuitions, since morality is often a matter of treating the values that can guide action in any given situation in relation to their proper rank, that is, doing the most highly valued thing you can do in a given situation. Thus, moral intuitions, just like the high-level values that shape them, would be incommensurable across cultures. One of the strengths of contemporary anthropology is that it demonstrates that collectivism and individualism are not the only high-level values that organize enduring societies around the world. Rather than listing here all the high-level values one can find in the anthropological literature, I'm going to contrast just two of them to show in a small bit of detail how they lead to incommensurable moral intuitions between people living in societies organized by them. So for the next few minutes, I'm really going to be an anthropologist and talk to you about a particular society. One of the high-level values I will consider is the well-known value of individualism, and the other is one that we can call relationalism, following the pattern of individualism, collectivism, holism. We'll call that relationalism, and I'll define that in a minute. I choose these two because my fieldwork among the Uratman people of Papua New Guinea frequently involved witnessing them confront the incommensurability between their traditional relational values and the individualist values they are faced with in their encounters with the post-colonial state and its tradition of law. I've already offered a quick definition of individualism as a value that holds that the highest good is allowing for the self-directed development of the individual. Relationalism, by contrast, is a value that takes the creation and maintenance of relations between people to be the highest good. Traditional Uratman society was, and their current society to a large extent still is, organized around the value of relationalism. Before exploring how the value of relationalism shapes Uratman moral lives, though, I should give a very brief bit of background on the Uratman community and its history. So the Uratman are a language group of 400 speakers who live in the far western highlands of the nation of Papua New Guinea, right by its border with Indonesia. They live at least 6 hours difficult walk from any of their neighbors, none of whom speak their language, and there are no roads or airstrips on their land connecting them to the wider world. They're subsistence gardeners and bow and arrow hunters who have little access to the market economy and no access to electricity. They were only colonized by the Australians in the sort of beginning in the 1950s, and no outside colonial or post-colonial government official has ever lived among them. Instead, these officials only pass through Uratman for very brief visits, mostly lasting only a few hours, and then maybe only once or twice a year. Given their relative isolation, Given their relative isolation, Eurotmen have a lot of scope to organize their lives around their own values, and they keenly feel the incommensurabilities that exist between their traditional values and the values from beyond their community to which they have been introduced, which sometimes attract them and at other times do not. The very high place the value of relationalism occupies in the hierarchy of values that shapes Eurotmen life is evident in their constant everyday practices of what anthropologists call gift exchange. The reciprocal giving and receiving of gifts governed not by considerations of profit, but by those of creating, acknowledging, or strengthening social relationships. Gifts in Eurotmen range from everyday offerings of garden produce to others to much more elaborate and often ritualized transfers of more rare, valuable items such as string bags, bows, pigs, and shell money, which happened at times of marriage, death, dispute resolution, or the creation of major new relationships that the people involved hope will become central to their lives in the future. To give a sense of the dense presence of gift exchange in Eurotmen daily life, I'm going to start my account of Eurotmen relationalism by looking at everyday gifts of foodstuffs. It's a matter of fact that no Eurotmen will go through a day without either giving some food to others or eating some foods others have given to them. As Eurotmen walk back to their villages from their gardens on the paths that crisscross their landscape, they give many people they meet at least a taro or a sweet potato, their staple crops, from the string bags that they carry. They likewise receive such humble gifts from many others they meet along their way home from their gardens. Everyone has these crops themselves, of course. So there's no material motive for these gifts. Instead, they're given to acknowledge and thereby maintain or grow the relationships that exist between the givers and the receivers. So important is this use of subsistence food items in gift exchange that Eurotmen have, the Urap language has two verbs to refer to eating. One, the more marked form, translates as to eat for nothing, to eat for no reason, which means eating food you've grown yourself, which goes for nothing because it doesn't do any relational work. The other verb, which we could translate simply as eating, refers to eating food someone else has given you, food which has been part of relation-enhancing gift exchanges. So strong is the hold of the value of relationalism on Eurotmen eating habits that even husband and wives who garden together will divide their gardens into his and hers halves so that the food they give each other counts as a gift, rather than as your own food production that you would then have to eat for nothing. One Eurotmen setting in which the moral intuitions fostered by the value of relationalism that shape everyday practices of gift exchange come into incommensurable conflict with the intuitions that follow from introduced individualist values is in the legal realm. The traditional and still most common way Eurotmen settle disputes is by exchanging exactly the same kinds of things with each other in precisely matched amounts at exactly the same time. So if you and I are in a dispute, for example, I might arrange to give you a string bag of a given size, and you will give me an identical one in the very same transaction. Once this is done, it is agreed that our dispute is finished and neither of us can go back to it without shame, which is a very powerful feeling, part of the sentimental order in Eurotmen, and possibly without sort of vaguely supernaturally caused illness. As one young Eurotmen man who had been to school outside of the community for a few years put it to me, such exchanges have no profit. But he continued, we do them anyway. Eurotmen do them and feel that it's ethical to do them because they realize the value of relationalism, that is the top of their traditional value hierarchy, at crucial moments when, because of disputes, because of bad feelings between people who have relationships with one another, the realization of that value is most under threat. The moral use of institutionalized expressions of relational values to settle disputes has, since the colonial era, been challenged by the Eurotmen recognition that the colonial and post-colonial governments prefer to handle disputes in a different way, one that expresses their own highest value of individualism. In this kind of dispute resolution, the ideal is to determine who is the guilty party in the dispute and penalize that person, either by having them give a one-way, unreciprocated compensation payment to the innocent party, or by having the guilty party alone endure some other kind of punishment. Rotman well recognized these two ways of handling disputes are realizing incommensurable values. One cannot both punish solely the guilty individual and reaffirm a pre-existing relationship that has been broken, at least as they understand it. One way they recognize this incommensurability is by stressing to one another that one should never call in the government judicial forces, either by summoning the police, who are a 6-hour walk away and would never come by themselves. Somebody has to go fetch them, or by taking their case to the government's district court, also 6 hours walk away. The reason these government resources for addressing disputes are to be avoided is that they end with individual solutions, which often include removing the guilty party to a jail outside of Rotman, which is, of course, the worst possible outcome in relational terms, because the person is just gone. Another setting in which the Rotman confront the incommensurability between a relational and individualist forms of adjudication is in the official local village court the government was busy establishing during the time of my fieldwork in the early 1990s. To launch this institution, the provincial government appointed a local man as magistrate of a new Rotman court and provided him with some formal training. I sat in on one of the first cases he adjudicated. This case came about because a woman had left her husband and gone back to live with her own family. I knew the magistrate well, and therefore knew that in this case he considered the husband, who was one of the most well-liked persons in Rotman, to be wholly innocent and the wife and her family wholly guilty. He may or may not have been right about that, but I know that that was his strong opinion. He acknowledged this view at the beginning of his verdict, saying that in legal terms set by the government, in this case, the woman's family would give the former husband compensation and receive nothing in return. But he went on, and I'm quoting him here, I know that in my jurisdiction, this way of doing things will not end the dispute. So I am ordering the husband to give something to the wife's family and the wife and her family to give something to the husband. In ruling in this way, he indicated that he held the relationalist outcome that led to reciprocal exchange to be a moral one rather than the individualist one that he knew the government felt to be moral. The basic thrust of his comments was that the values of relationalism and individualism were not commensurable, and when they clashed in his court, he's going to rank relationalism more highly and define moral outcomes in its terms. And in fact, that's what he did in all of the cases that I attended. They always ended in a sort of traditional gifts going both. Oh, okay. So this next section is called Anthropology and the Incommensurability of Values from Relationalism to Universalism, and it's not about the Rotman anymore. Anthropologists have been discovering different high-level values and different moral intuitions linked to them from the beginning of their discipline's history. Up until the 1980s, the way anthropologists, particularly North American ones, dealt with the ethical issues raised by these differences was by developing the doctrines of cultural and moral relativism. At the heart of these doctrines, which were never intended to be philosophically sophisticated, but were carefully thought out in the anthropologist's own terms nonetheless, was the claim that while all cultures distinguish between moral and immoral ways of acting, they do so in relation to widely different values and understandings of the world, and thus develop distinctive moral codes. The reasonableness of any people's moral codes, intuitions, and pronouncements thus has to be understood in relation to their own values and other elements of their view of the world. Only when one puts moral intuitions into their cultural context in this way can one make sense of them. But once one does this, once you do put moral intuitions in context in this way, anthropological relativists assert that no society's moral ideas will seem, freakish or unnatural or in any simple way wrong-headed. Okay. Another related plank of the relativist platform that had a huge effect on how anthropologists themselves lived is that one cannot judge the morality of one culture in the terms set by another. As the philosopher John Cook has put this point, relativism demands a stance of what he calls moral recusal on the part of anthropologists, who are professionally enjoined not to render judgment on the morality of those they study from their own cultural points of view. So strong was relativist commitment in mid-20th century anthropology that the American Anthropological Association, the largest anthropological association in the world, registered a formal dissent to the passage of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, arguing in effect that it was based on an individual's morality that was not shared by all the cultures of the world, thereby exposing those who lived in those cultures that didn't rank individualism highly to negative judgment for violating moral principles that were not their own. The relativist position turned out to be a methodological boon for anthropology, allowing those working in the discipline to patiently dig very deeply into the cultures and moralities of other people without clouding their efforts with attempts to render judgment on their lives, including their moral lives of the people they were studying, at least in the anthropologist's own moral terms. This stance was once relatively easy for anthropologists to adopt, and I think this is an important point about the times we're in the moment for global ethics. It was once relatively easy for anthropologists to adopt because it fit well with the dominant mid-20th century Western liberal understanding of the primary value the primary value that should organize international relations was one of allowing all cultures and societies the right to self-determination. During the period of decolonization, the right to self-determination was, at least one of the highest values, I think, of international, thinking about international relations. By the 1970s, however, and I think Dr. Gasper, you referred to this as the cascade, the human rights cascade from 70s to 90s. By the 1970s, however, the value of cultural self-determination began to fade from the top of at least the Western hierarchy of concerns in approaching international relations. It was replaced in this role by the promotion of human rights as the most important global value. Human rights now ranked above self-determination, and societies could be condemned for following their own cultural traditions in a self-determining way if those traditions did not recognize the rights of human individuals to live their lives as they saw fit, as long as they didn't harm other people. As the influential historian of human rights Samuel Moyn puts it, quoting him now, human rights entered global rhetoric in a kind of hydraulic relationship with self-determination. To the extent that the one appeared and progressed, the other declined or even disappeared. A relativist anthropology was not so neatly aligned with the value of human rights as it had been with that of self-determination. And by the 1980s, relativism began to fade as a cultural anthropological ideal. Unsurprisingly, at that time, anthropologists began to make moves to atone for what they now saw as the discipline's sin of dissenting from the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which many of them began to declare that history had shown that these criticisms had been a terrible mistake. Finally, in 1999, the American Anthropological Association issued a, quote, Declaration of Anthropology and Human Rights that it asserts, quoting it again, in practical terms builds on the UN Declaration and related international declarations and treaties. Alongside this turnabout in the discipline's official stance, more and more anthropologists began to document not the variety of moral ideas found in different societies, but rather how people in various parts of the world, including those that rarely receive international media attention, suffer human rights abuses, including oppression, poverty, and other forms of harm understood in largely Western terms. They no longer want to, the anthropologists, that is, no longer want to recuse themselves from making moral judgments about lives they think are not going as well as they should through no fault of the people who are living them. And in the face of this change, the strong disciplinary drive to study cultural differences has weakened for many anthropologists. And while this does not mean that they no longer produce useful and informative research, it does mean that they have little that is anthropologically original to say about global ethics. Instead, they ultimately reproduce the ethics of human rights that are dominant in the liberal democracies from which so many of them come, or where many others have been trained. I think that this retreat from relativism has limited the contribution that anthropology can make to the discussion of global ethics. And in response, I'd like to suggest, very briefly, a position that can restore some of the field's strength in this regard while not requiring the strict moral recusal that relativism demands and that many anthropologists are no longer willing to accept. The position I have in mind is one that in philosophy is called value pluralism. The brief account of the value pluralist position I present here draws most heavily from Isaiah Berlin, but it should be noted that the social sciences have their own older expression of this position from the pen of the founding sociologist Max Weber, which Berlin claims never to have read Weber later in his life, although he had cited him. And also, although he read everything, as far as I can tell, so who knows. Anyway, at the heart of the value pluralist position are two claims. The first is that there exists in the world more than one high-level value that can support an enduring society, the members of which can lead flourishing lives. The second is that these good, really existing values can be incommensurable with each other, such that a single society cannot put two or more of them at the very top of its hierarchy of values without becoming culturally incoherent. The situation of the Oratman magistrate illustrates this point, as he has come to realize that he cannot promote relational and individualist forms of justice to an equal extent, even though both are viable high-level values in worlds he knows about, his own and in the sort of government world. As noted earlier, individualism and collectivism are not the only candidates for the status of high-level values that anthropologists have found. Arguably, collectivism, hierarchy, egalitarianism, and perhaps even anarchism are other such values, though they are also incommensurable with each other and with relationalism and individualism as well. A key point, and this is really what I've been driving toward, that follows from the existence of a number of viable but incommensurable high-level values is that no one society can promote all of them to the top of its hierarchy. This means no one can fully understand the range of possible ingredients that could go into the making of a widely acceptable global ethics by knowing only about the ethical intuitions that hold in one society, including, of course, their own. As the political philosopher John Rawls phrases a related point, I think he thinks he's glossing Berlin here, from the perspective of value pluralism, quote, there is no social world without loss. That is, no social world that does not exclude some ways of life that realize in special ways certain fundamental values. To put this more positively, and in a way that lays a foundation for anthropology's contribution to the discussion of global ethics, every culture can teach us about some fundamental values that can contribute to the development of a global ethics, but not about others, because each culture encourages its members to build their ethical system around only one, or at the most, a commensurable set of them. Anthropologists informed by value pluralism can therefore contribute to the task of building a truly global ethic by showing in detail how different groups of people live moral lives in the light of different high-level values, and encouraging those having conversations about a global ethics to take all of these diverse, incommensurable values into account. Crafting a conversation of this kind could return anthropologists to a secure place in pressing global conversations that they once had. They once did have a secure place there, but have largely given up in their turn away from relativism and toward the morality of human rights. Can I take one more minute? I have one more page. Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm sorry. I know this is. So this is on the prospects for a minimum consensus on global ethics, which was another of the questions we were presented with. I'm going to take up the question of what a minimum consensus on global ethics might be achievable for humanity at this time, again, from an anthropological perspective, by way of a one-minute conclusion. I can get to this question from the point where I left off just now by pointing out that value pluralism is well suited for anthropology now because it is not a form of relativism, a position Berlin in particular was eager to assert. It's not a form of relativism because it does not hold that all values a group of people might promote to a high level and attempt to build a society around are in fact good ones. Some values cannot bear this heavy load, and some things people take to be values and are in fact not good, but are disvalues that cannot bear any moral load at all. For this reason, value pluralism does not require complete moral recusal, even as it does promote an openness to exploring the full range of values that, when raised to a high position in a society's value hierarchy, can support flourishing human lives. Since moral recusal is not required, anthropologists who adopt value pluralism in the hopes of offering creative input into discussions of global ethics need not completely give up their right to call out situations of genuine oppression, poverty, and suffering, and the genuinely bad values that foster them, even as they will need to be careful not to define such situations only in terms supported by their own culturally shaped institutions. Given the incommensurability between both viable high-level values and the moral institutions, the intuitions they foster, it strikes me that it would be hard, if not impossible, to reach a minimum consensus on a positive moral framework that everyone should adopt in the face of a diversity of the diversity of high-level values that are found across cultures in the present global world. But what if we took a clue from the anti-relativism of value pluralism and suggested that global ethical discussions work toward a minimum consensus on values that are not viable candidates for organizing a society around, or that are not even good, but rather should be defined as disvalues? Might it be easier to achieve consensus on what, in moral terms, society should all seek to avoid, rather than those all society should seek to promote? Perhaps we can create what we might call a global ethical solidarity around the rejection of the bad more easily, or perhaps even more fairly, than we can around the promotion of a universally defined good. Might we find our minimum consensus this way? And here's my last little bit. In making this point, I draw on the political philosopher Judith Sklar's increasingly widely circulating argument about the liberalism of fear. In the great liberal political philosophical game of establishing a minimum commitment or set of commitments people must adopt if a good society is to be created, even if such adoption does not suit their personal dispositions, which are otherwise sovereign in the liberal scheme, Sklar proposes that a good social order must minimally be built on, quote, the avoidance of fear and cruelty. For Sklar, as Edward Hall has recently noted, fear and cruelty are what he calls negative universals that everyone should reject. And perhaps they're not the only negative universals we could find. The philosopher Avishai Margalit, for example, has proposed that any decent society must not contain institutions that humiliate any of its members. One might argue that identifying negative universals will be as difficult as identifying positive ones. After all, there's no guarantee that different societies will define fear, cruelty, or humiliation in the same way, nor that they will agree on what kinds of social institutions cause them to come about. But we will not know if such discussions will be difficult in the same way as those about positive goods until we try to have them. It is for this reason that I suggest that as a first step toward finding a minimum consensus, the first step on a global ethics, we might do well to promote a conversation on negative universals of this kind, at the same time recognizing that a minimum consensus around a highest positive good, rather than one based on avoiding evil, will be at best a long-term project for a species for which value pluralism appears to be a fact of life. Thanks. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Sorry to have gone so long. Yeah, I didn't turn it off.
Sorry.
So, yeah.
That it will be hard, if not impossible, to reach a minimum consensus on a positive moral framework. So it's a minimum consensus, not a comprehensive
Right.
consensus. But then in the next page, you go ahead to, in fact, sketch such a possible minimum
Yes, that's
consensus,
right, that's right.
which is my second thought, which is actually pretty close to United Nations language of freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity,
Yes.
which is, embodied in quite a lot of United Nations, not just language, but initiatives, frameworks, etc. So we arguably have some starting points here, which have already been started.
Yeah.
So the first step is long since taken.
Got it. Okay. I'll take that and consider my conclusion as suffering a bit from my anthropological naivete about where other discussions in other places have gotten on this, and I'm glad to hear that we've already gotten there. Part of it, though, is thinking about how we would justify these. And I again, I'm not a scholar of sort of the UN and its language. I learned a lot from your presentation, but I was trying to get to a way of justifying that approach that I thought anthropologists might find congenial. And I do agree, I took the language of minimum consensus from the abstract, and I probably by the end there I was saying a kind of maximum consensus is going to be hard to find, but I was sort of trapped in the language I had adopted. But I think you're right.
If I may, thank you for this spectacularly beautiful presentation. I have a question about the idea of incommensurable systems of values. Do you make any room for evolution, for change? Like we know that, if we look at the societies we know best, each of us, we can probably see that there has been an evolution. In Western society, we probably do not share the same set of values that we shared, say, in the 13th century or 12th century. Some is still there, but something changed. So is there a way for these incommensurable, is there a possibility for these incommensurable systems of values to slowly move in a way that makes them less incommensurable? I was intrigued by your story of the young European guy who went to study outside. So what happened to him? Could he merge different things? Could he develop a way of seeing things that would bring together differences? There was a very nice essay by a sociologist or philosopher, Schutz, Alfred Schutz, who wrote a beautiful paper called The Stranger. Yes. I think it was in the late 40s or something like that, describing something. So I'm wondering whether there is a way in for evolution in this incommensurability.
Yeah, that young man who was also, for social structural reasons, he was very bright and people liked him, but he was not going to be extremely powerful in this society. He couldn't bring about these changes himself, but through the work of institution building, the part I left out about this is the Arab also converted themselves. They were never missionized, but they sent out their children to places that had been, and they built church institutions that are mostly organized around individualist kinds of values. And in those institutions, people can explore them, although they feel very keenly the tension with their relational values. So they actually feel, they feel very morally disappointed most of the time. If they're being good traditional people, they're being bad Christians. If they're being good Christians, they're being bad. That's the period in which I lived with them. My guess is eventually they will build institutions that allow them also to organize their society institutionally, probably if they ever get integrated into the market. But they can't do that just by wanting to. So that's where that institution building, you have to. I read a interview with the theologian Stanley Hauerwas once. I guess he's pretty well known in ethics circles, where he talked about how his father was a bricklayer in the United States and grew up in a very racist milieu. And he said it was really interesting because he felt his father very strongly was not a racist, but he had absolutely no institutional settings in which he could express that. So it did, in terms of how he led his life, it didn't change much. But yeah, so I do think there is evolution and change, and I think it's that kind of institution building that's where that can happen in an enduring way. But often for individuals, it's extremely painful.
Yeah, no, I thought it's really interesting talk. And you started from Charles Taylor and his idea of hypergoods, and then you moved very quickly from hypergoods to incommensurability, whereas Taylor's whole project is about showing that things that people think are incommensurable, in fact, aren't. So that if you read Sources of the Self, where you took the stuff on hypergoods from, that you see that he spends 500 or 600 pages explaining how different hypergoods have risen and fallen in Western civilization. So that there's an interesting set of chapters, for example, on on the Reformation and what he describes as the affirmation of ordinary life, how the idea of merely sort of having a business and having a family suddenly became something that a way of being a good Christian in a way that it hadn't before. So I think he's keenly aware of the way in which these have shifted, and what he thinks that sort of history of ideas, the kind of philosophy he does, is a way of allowing us to inhabit those other perspectives and be able to sort of interpret between hypergoods and sort of maybe judge between them and see whether it was a loss or a gain. So I think that there's a way of sort of bringing together some of the philosophy in a way that would may be compatible with your pluralism, but would allow us to sort of go beyond the claim of incommensurability.
I completely agree. I actually have another, it's not published, but another paper where but that's really important, I think, for global ethics. So that's why I'm really glad you brought it up. I mean, part of what Taylor's sort of explaining is that it isn't any one given value that provides its shape to a way of life. It's a combination of values and how they are made to work together. And that strikes me as that's why you could have a conversation about a global ethic that took into account all of these different values we know that some societies really highlight, like relationships, like hierarchy, like freedom, it's sort of anarchist kind of freedom, because the trick would be to get them in the right relationship. That's how I read Taylor by the end of Source of the Self, that it's the relations. And there's a lot, I mean, I couldn't do that today, but I think anthropologists have done very good work empirically on how societies get those things in relationship through institutions, which is what the Rotman don't yet have, the institutions to get sort of relationalism and individualism in a working order together. But if they could achieve that, they'd have something more like what Taylor. So I think well, I'm glad you've helped affirm my confidence in what I also thought Taylor was saying. And I think that for global ethics, that's a powerful vision because it doesn't involve throwing stuff out.
I agree.
Thank you. We have a tea break.
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It's about 10 minutes tea break, and I think it's supposed to have a late lunch today, so it's probably pick up in the restroom. This way,
Yeah, I found your talk really helpful in thinking about how you get from.
Obviously, good job.
Thanks.
I want to make a correct point. You want to make like a fear as a negative universal. That means that
it's right here.
For global ethics, it's possible. They also should be as a principle to restrict fear of.
Yes,